Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Farrell Hoy-Janab. I'm the Director of Faculty Development. And tonight we have our college scholar, David Vanderham, who is relatively new to the college, but very interesting work.
Almost 4 semesters.
From the beginning, I knew his work was going to be really interesting. So I will tell you that coming up on March 2nd, we've got Kevin Caldwell, who will, as a college scholar, present on philosophy in prison, the love of knowledge, and community engagement. And then on April 4th, we have Dennis Arjo, who will speak about academic freedom in the midst of a culture war, which we are all interested in. But for tonight, we have David Vanderham, and very glad to have him. He's an assistant professor of humanities at Johnson County Community College, where he teaches courses in interdisciplinary humanities. After receiving a bachelor's and master's degree in guitar performance, while pursuing a thriving freelance career in Colorado, Dr. Vanderham completed his MA and PhD in musicology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research pursues the theme of virtuosities through both fieldwork and archival methods, exploring how wide-ranging displays and discourses of musical skill carry meaning for audience in the U.S. during the age of electronic media. Dr. Vanderham presents regularly on this topic at regional, national, and international conferences, and his work has been published in multiple leading scholarly outlets, but true. His work has been published in multiple leading scholarly, including Oxford Bibliographies in Music, American Music, and the Journal of Society for American Music. In 2021, his article, "I'm Just an Armless Guitarist," received the Richard Waterman Prize, which recognizes the best article by a junior scholar in the ethnomusicological study of popular music. I would hardly call you a junior scholar, but well-deserved. In addition...
He's less than 10 years out of the PhD.
Yeah, okay. In addition to these publications, he is co-editor alongside Harris Berger and Friedland Riedel of the Oxford Handbook of the Phenomenology of Music Cultures, which will be published later in the year. So I ask you now to welcome David Vanderham tonight to the...
Where's my papers?
Sorry.
That's okay. Should try to take my talk. That would have been interesting. Thank you so much, Farrell, for your work facilitating this talk, and also the whole College Scholars Program. I'm looking forward to the other 2 talks coming up. And I'm grateful to all of you for coming out. I know Monday night, already week 4 of the semester, feels a little bit like there's too much to do. I should probably be at home grading. I have some students here who are like, yes, you should be at home grading. Wrap it up. Get to it. I also think it's appropriate, given the broad scope of my talk, to say I'm really glad just to be in an interdisciplinary department helmed by Allison Smith, who can't be here, which means I can make some Tar Heel references. Right? Yeah? Okay, good. And it reminds me, actually, hearing of Dennis's upcoming talk. I think a lot of times about an article I read just a few weeks into my first semester here that was written by a historian from UNC Chapel Hill about the history of academic freedom and specifically tenure. Her argument in that little opinion piece in the New York Times was that the specialization of knowledge and the demand for increasing prestige and a high volume of publications had actually really cut into intellectual freedom. As she put it, academic freedom no longer includes the freedom to be a generalist. I'm very glad to say that I found a professional home where I do, in fact, enjoy that freedom, and I will be exercising it liberally, all right? So with that said, virtuosity is the key term in this talk and in my research overall, and I want to begin by asking for a simple show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the concept of virtuosity or the virtuoso in some way? Okay, most of us. It's about what I assumed. I've been working on these topics for roughly a decade, which ought to, I would hope, make me an expert in the room. But as I'll discuss, virtuosity, which if you're not one of those who raised your hand, is generally understood to mean the display of exceptional skill, and virtuoso, which is generally understood to be the one who displays such skill, are terms that do not belong to the experts, much as we might want to claim them. The terms don't even belong exclusively to the arts, as they've recently been used to describe everything from athletic performances, such as LeBron James' pursuit of the NBA scoring title, to excellence in business acumen. This is not the only person to make this analogy either. To, and this one's my favorite, frozen pizza. I see this, and I sometimes feel like this is from an alternate universe where I had to go into marketing instead of academia. I was like, what if you call it virtuoso? I can't vouch for it. I've never actually seen this on the shelves, but apparently the perfection is baked in. And the phenomenon of virtuosity, to be clear, isn't limited to those who even know the concept or use the term. Even those of you who did not raise your hand, who have never heard the word before out in the wild, have likely experienced virtuosity in your awe at a pianist's speed or a rapper's flow or a guitarist's blazing solo. You may have even unknowingly utilized its rhetoric, as fans of many genres regularly make superlative statements about the mastery and power displayed by their favorite artists. This widespread nature of virtuosity is part of why it has long been a complex and contested topic in music studies, which is the term that I'll be using throughout this talk to refer to a group of subdisciplines that include historical musicology, ethnomusicology, music theory, and popular music studies. I believe I'm the only person here who is in any way affiliated with those, so they'll just be music studies. Virtuosos have been celebrated as superhuman, but also derided as superficial, often for the very same performance. So why can virtuosity be both appealing and disturbing? What does virtuosity tell us about music, the arts, and human values? These are the questions that drive my overall project, but before I can proceed to answer them in any meaningful way, I need to pursue some more basic points of inquiry, and these are signaled in the title of my talk. The research questions are hidden only so very little, okay? What is the history of virtuosity? Why do we care about it? Scholars in music studies have offered responses to these questions that are sensible, widely accepted, and I will argue fundamentally wrong. My talk will proceed in 3 steps. I'll first present and critique 2 scholarly responses to each of these questions. I will then sketch my own account of virtuosity's history, with particular emphasis on virtuosity's long-standing link to mediation, which I'll then demonstrate through a brief concluding case study. Once I've done this, the appeal of virtuosity and the cause for controversy surrounding it will come into clearer focus. As social boundaries loosen and shift through the mediation of print, then sound recording, then radio and streaming, skill becomes a matter of public discourse in the marketplace rather than private judgment amongst experts. The question of why we care is, first of all, a question of who we are. Who gets to weigh in on the matter in the first place? Whose experience is deemed meaningful or legitimate? The French scholar and critic Vladimir Jankelevich declares that virtuosity is a near constant. It is as old as music. This answers the question of virtuosity's history by giving it one so vast that we aren't really meant or able to ask further questions about it. The overwhelming scope of this history thus has the same effect as denying that virtuosity has a history at all. Music's origins lie shrouded in a distant evolutionary past, and there lies virtuosity with it. Jankelevich doesn't go in search of evidence for his claim, but if we're so inclined, the logic seems to suggest simply that there have always been musicians more skilled than others, and these musicians have always been sources of awe and inspiration. If we feel further compelled to seek out actual evidence in recorded history, we could look to poet-musicians in archaic Greece, for example. And here's my lone reference to ancient Greece for my students from classical mythology. Who did, in fact, tour, participate in competitions, and generally seek fame and fortune through the display of exceptional skill. Given that ancient Greece is as far back as our historical imaginations are often willing to stretch, why shouldn't we just assume that virtuosity is universal? Well, the problem with this non-history of virtuosity is twofold. First, it depends on an implicit definition of virtuosity as the simple presence of impressive skill. Second, with that definition insinuated, it goes on to assume that such impressive skill will, by nature, impress. Neither assumption works, however, because virtuosity has long been recognized as a social phenomenon. Jankelevich himself actually points this out in his aphoristic declaration. There are no unrecognized virtuosi. This isn't a claim that meritocracy reigns supreme without fail in the whole of musical history. Certainly, some skilled musicians do not receive their due recognition. Instead, what he means is that one does not become a virtuoso simply by being sufficiently skilled. Virtuosity is about skill that is in some way public. Virtuosity, then, is not a degree or type of skill, but skill put in a particular social relation to others. If what I just said is true, and I firmly believe that it is, then asserting the universality of virtuosity requires a concurrent assertion that human beings have always lived in social arrangements and musical cultures that might give rise to virtuosity. I do not have time to get into the limited scholarship on music's evolutionary history, nor archaeological accounts of human prehistory, but I will tell you that such an assertion is absurd. So, on to our second response. In contrast to the tendency to place virtuosity in the distant mythical past of musical development, most scholarly discussions of the topic center on 19th century Europe. The general formula is to focus on a virtuoso violinist or pianist from the era, including Robert Schumann, Niccolò Paganini, or especially Franz Liszt. Liszt was an astounding pianist who exploited the technical possibilities of his instrument while also building his celebrity and essentially inventing the solo recital format that focused attention solely on the lone virtuoso on stage. There's good reason there's so much scholarship on Liszt. He's an important figure, and he makes for a fantastic read. But Liszt's prominence in historical musicology and the implicit presence of his model elsewhere has given rise to what James DeVille has dubbed the Liszt problem. Simply put, Liszt dominates the conceptualization of virtuosity in music studies, even when it's far, far, far from his 19th century Parisian context. Despite scholarly arguments that stress the historical and cultural specificity of Liszt's example, he still serves as the implicit template for interpreting virtuosity. And even scholarship that never mentions his name, whether it covers genres from jazz to heavy metal and beyond, remains largely consistent with his precedent in their emphasis on technical innovation, speed, masculinized and often sexualized power, and overwhelming display. Liszt is the first rock star is a standard phrase people say in their music history classes to try to get the students to pay attention. In this way, explicit or implicit references to Liszt function more as myth than history. This isn't to say that the scholarship on Liszt is full of errors or really lacking in any significant way, but that his invocation in other scholarship often insinuates a direct pseudo-archetypal link between the 19th century pianist and another later musical development. This brackets out the intervening history in order to let the mythic moment speak to the chosen example. It allows scholars to draw a straight line from a salon in 1840s Paris to a studio in late 20th century Los Angeles or really anywhere else in the world, all without regard for whether these two moments are really connected at all or what the historical and musical developments happening between them may have been. Thus, Liszt often doesn't serve as historical precedent. Instead, his mythical invocation relieves us of the burden of considering actual historical development or connection. We can say more about that later if we need to. So let's turn to the appeal of virtuosity. I'll begin here with a warning. You will likely never encounter a scholarly claim about anything that is worded more strongly than what I'm about to read to you. The Russian psychologist and musicologist Dina Kernskaya asserts straightforwardly that everyone everywhere has always liked the sporting side of the musical art. Again, everyone everywhere always. The demonstration of the ability of the performing artist to play dynamically and precisely. So, like Jankelevich earlier, Kernskaya makes virtuosity and its appeal a human universal, and she's hardly alone in doing so. The problem here is that, despite the strong wording, the trope of virtuosity's constant appeal is rivaled in its persistence only in the opposite assertion, that virtuosity is a source of constant disagreement. Attempts to define the imagined distinctions between transcendent and superficial virtuosity became a standard feature of public musical discourse throughout Europe during the 19th century. This conflict continued into the 20th century as critics noted with dismay how listeners' severe lack of musical knowledge did not stop them from following their supposed natural bent in worshiping virtuoso violinists. And by mid-century, Mark Panschel declared that the concert culture of Western classical music was the site of a quasi-permanent quarrel about virtuosity, where writers, critics, and composers looked upon virtuosic display as a, quote, debasement of taste, even as the public strongly favored it. We're left then with a strange set of assertions. First, everyone loves virtuosity. Second, they also don't know what it is. Thirdly, the people who do know what it is generally hate the virtuosity that everybody else loves but also have incorrectly identified. So, we'll try to move on with this other response. The philosopher V.A. Howard offers a tidy solution to this intractable web of disagreements and mistrust between critics and audiences. Just ignore the public entirely. According to Howard, virtuosity is a verdict issued and a garland bestowed by a well-qualified critical community. In this understanding, the appeal of virtuosity lies in its outcome. Critics hail the best musicians because the best musicians make the best music. It's all very reasonable. But if I've made my points well thus far, you may have already spotted some problems with Howard's explanation. He's made virtuosity intelligible only by severely limiting its scope. In fact, all the non-musicians in the room can just leave. You're no longer needed here. Thank you. You got out. It was only like, yeah, go ahead. No, please stay here. Howard has settled the conflict between experts and general audiences by simply cutting all you non-experts out of the equation. Now, to be fair, Howard doesn't actually explicitly address the question of why general audiences are drawn to virtuosity. They simply insist on having their own opinions, apparently, and these don't align with the proper judgments of the critical community. I don't mean to pile on Howard here, but there are two other things that we must discuss that are raised by his raised by his approach to virtuosity. So first, I have had hundreds of casual conversations that show how useless this expert-centered definition of virtuosity is. I meet someone, they make the mistake of asking what I do, especially when I was a graduate student, and I said, I think about a dissertation all the time. They said, what about? I said, virtuosity and impressive skill. And they say, I don't know anything about music, but, right? That but is a very, very important rhetorical move that simultaneously cedes ground to me as an expert while also holding me at arm's length, right? They're making clear that I can't impinge upon their preferences, much less negate their previous musical experiences. The second problem with Howard's account is that if virtuosity is simply excellence recognized by experts, then it's essentially confined to the informal guild of insiders and practitioners, and the word is now synonymous with craft. The concept of virtuosity becomes redundant. We just don't need it. As I'm about to show you, however, the term virtuosity arose at a particular historical moment to address a particular historical phenomenon, the judgment of skill bursting beyond the world of experts into a general market, often with the aid of media. So I've shown you thus far that historical considerations of virtuosity tend to focus either on the ancient, even prehistoric world, or the world of 19th century Europe, especially Paris. I've also shown you that the assumptions about virtuosity based on those historical contexts generally fail to offer a satisfactory account of where virtuosity comes from, why it appeals to us, or even what it is. So I want to move now towards making my own contribution to understanding virtuosity with a brief history beginning in the Renaissance. I'll tell you, my slides here will start to look a little more class-like. This is the most information-heavy part of the talk. I apologize, there will be no quiz. This approach of thinking about virtuosity beginning in the Renaissance is decidedly uncommon in music studies, which is surprising for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I'm largely dependent here on a rich secondary literature. It's just that these are pieced together in little parts of it, not gathered together in a single strand as I've done here. The other even more surprising thing is that the terms virtuoso and virtuosity were coined in Italy during the middle of the Renaissance, in the early 16th century. So in their original usage, these terms describe the presence and display of cultivated skill and knowledge in any particular craft, art, or science. They directly mirrored two prevalent streams of thought in the Renaissance related to their Latin root word, where possessing virtu meant both a propensity towards actions of conventional moral good, as well as general efficacy or power. Machiavelli's kind of lurking in the background here, for those of you who know that. The virtuoso aimed at admirable ends and also possessed the necessary power and acumen, whether mental or physical, to accomplish the desired outcome. So in this early sense, music was only one of many possible domains in which one might be a virtuoso. These linguistic developments took place alongside the rise of music publishing, also in Italy, also at the same time. And just as the terms virtuoso and virtuosity spread throughout Europe and entered the French, English, and German languages, music publishing similarly spread across the continent throughout the 16th century. Prior to this time, manually produced books and writing itself had almost exclusively been the privilege of scribes, monks, and others able to gain access to libraries kept in monasteries. The same print revolution that we so often think of as transforming the availability of written text and images was having a similar impact on music. It's interesting to note that the kinds of musical skill that the printed page could best represent were precisely those that the term denoted when applied to a musician during this time. excellence as a composer or theorist, because they could put it on the page. The publication of compositions, treatises, and instructional books crossed the social boundaries that had previously kept the most accomplished musicians cloistered within the aristocratic court or prestigious chapel, and this bursting of social boundaries was something that musicians of the day recognized and even highlighted in their print offerings. In 1593, for example, one famous singer from the papal chapel in Rome published Quick and Easy Way to Execute Ornaments, which promised access to musical exploits previously available, quote, only in great cities and in the courts of princes. Already, media was taking musical skill outside the bastions of religious and political power and their clear hierarchies. In the 17th century, the meanings of virtuosity and virtuoso began to narrow. Sebastian de Brossard's 1703 Dictionary of Music offered a definition similar to the one from the 16th century, noting that the title of virtuoso could apply to painters and architects, for example, but by this time it was most often reserved for excellent musicians. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the meaning of the term increasingly shifted towards musical performance, although many virtuosi were avid composers and improvisers in addition to their exploits as performers. This shift in meaning coincided first of all with the introduction of public concerts in which music was the primary object of attention rather than an accompaniment to another entertainment or ritual, which is the standard in Europe and really the rest of the world prior to that time. In these more music-centric events, the rise of the opera and concerto as popular public genres gave an extended role to the soloist. And all this, the shift in the term's meaning, the spread of the public concert, and the growth of the genres I just mentioned, happened concurrently with the rise of music criticism and journalism in the 18th century, and its proliferation into music-specific journals in the 19th century. As Alexander Stefaniak argues, the growth of the public concert and mass markets for instruments and printed music helped make the virtuoso a star at the center of musical life in the 19th century. Thus, the changes in virtuosity's meaning during the 19th century were not so much a result of technological innovations in media as they were a growth of markets for and interest in certain forms of media. During the early 20th century, the meaning of virtuosity narrowed yet again, mirroring the increasingly narrow division of musical labor. The virtuoso as performer-composer, embodied by Franz Liszt, who mostly wrote his own compositions, or Niccolò Paganini, increasingly gave way to the virtuoso as an exceptionally skilled interpreter of other people's music. Even when the term began to be used to describe performances in popular genres such as jazz, bluegrass, rock, or heavy metal, where those performers were very often improvisers or songwriters, it still primarily referred to performance skill. And then the advent of recording and broadcast technology meant that such performance-based virtuosity was no longer a fundamentally live phenomenon that listeners attended to in a singular place or time. Cylinders, discs, and later technologies meant that live performances were now increasingly required to live up to recordings, whose repeatability brought the possibility of greater scrutiny. More broadly, as Kiri Miller puts it, virtuosity in the age of electronic media increasingly became collaborative, dispersed, and mediated. This is where the secondary literature gets far more sparse, and not coincidentally, the case studies that comprise the bulk of my book project start. One of the effects of the Liszt problem has been that the presumed liveness of virtuosity has persisted in our conceptualization, even though music has undergone media revolution after media revolution over the last 100 years or so. To put it simply, scholars in music studies are talking about media, and scholars in music studies are talking about virtuosity, but they very rarely overlap. That was a whirlwind history. I take you through it for the purposes of a big takeaway to prove that I'm not just trying to mislead you. The big takeaway from this overview of the interwoven development of terminology, music, and media is that despite the tendency to treat virtuosity as a historical constant with universal appeal, there is no enduring essence to the concept of virtuosity. Now, I assure you, and again, the reason I've shown my work here is because I want to assure you that this is not an example of a reckless academic unmooring an otherwise stable concept in order to make anything mean anything. The meaning of the term has shifted regularly throughout its relatively short linguistic history as different types of skill become salient and different musical and cultural values were emphasized. In fact, its usage now seems to have come full circle. As I showed you at the outset, any number of skills might now be reason to use the term. Chefs, painters, athletes, scientists, entrepreneurs, all can be praised for their virtuosity. Such open-endedness might leave you wondering what good the concept could be. But I'm not suggesting we should abandon the term or that somehow everything is now virtuosity. In my 2020 article on virtuosity and disability, I outlined a definition that aims to account for the shifting nature of the phenomenon. Virtuosity is skill made apparent and socially meaningful. The distinguishing feature of my account lies in its insistence that sociality, social relations in general, are not just central to virtuosity's interpretation, but to its very constitution. Virtuosity is social from the very beginning. It's neither individual excellence nor external judgment, but skill made apparent. This is an intentionally passive construction that highlights the fact that any number of figures might be exercising agency within it. It's not just performers who make their skill apparent. It's also listeners and their assumptions, promoters and their rhetoric, and sometimes even the medium itself, its perceptual affordances and cultural meanings. When I first uttered the phrase, skill made apparent and socially meaningful, I was not met with gasps of amazement as you all had intellectual epiphanies, and I will forgive you for being somewhat underwhelmed. This definition is, after all, remarkably thin. But this is a virtue, I assure you, not a flaw. My definition is not meant to fix the phenomenon within firm boundaries, but to prompt some basic question that more narrow definitions tend to take for granted. What counts as skill? Why does it matter? Who and what makes it apparent? To show how posing these questions with an eye towards mediation opens the door to a better understanding of virtuosity, I want to turn briefly to a case study that expands the history of virtuosity in a direction that you may find surprising. In the 1930s, what would retroactively be considered early country music was most often referred to by fans and industry insiders alike as hillbilly. The music performed and sold under this label was a sampling of everything from old ballads and jazz-inflected numbers to cowboy songs and obligatory fiddle tunes. And it was broadcast to homes north and south, urban and rural, as the genre was especially prominent on Saturday night radio variety programs billed as barn dances. This format claimed and, in fact, pretended on air to be based on social gatherings of rural communities, though it was most indebted to the comedy and stage antics of vaudeville and the minstrel shows that had come before it. In addition to music, the programs featured a great deal of talk, references to economic hardship, jokes, advertisements presented as friendly neighborly advice, and ongoing commentary on musical acts. It's here that we encounter an ongoing discourse about both the value and nature of musical skill and the construction of what I call down-home virtuosity. Announcers on these programs regularly make folksy exclamations following a performance. Statements like, "Them boys can sure tromp on the strings," or "Watch old Gene cutting up on that banjo," are common. As you might guess from these examples, my nerdy phrase, down-home virtuosity, does not appear on these programs. At that point, the word virtuosity would have been too synonymous with European classical music, which was a style that barn dance radios regularly contrasted themselves with. And indeed, down-home virtuosity turns many of the traditional assumptions about virtuosity drawn from the European classical tradition on their head. Instead of shameless self-promotion and obvious braggadocio, the performers on barn dance programs were generally humble, or at least humble adjacent. And their musical performances are sometimes understated. The serious virtuoso of the concert tradition is likewise nowhere to be found on barn dance radio. When musicians on these programs do show off, their overt displays are very often followed by jokes that poke fun at them in order to bring them back down and restore an air of humility. These programs regularly walked a fine line between accepting the superior social status of urban and literate musical traditions like opera, while also asserting the unique value of their vernacular tradition. A 1933 script for a program called Renfro Valley Folks on WLS Chicago includes a sketch where the MC, John Lair, seen here, has an extended conversation with a school teacher character following a performance of the fiddle tune Old Joe Clark. Note how even the written dialect, and we don't have a recording of this, but the written dialect demarcates the regional identities of each speaker. How'd you like that, Miss Sally? Of course, it ain't fine music like you hear back in Cincinnati, but we think it's pretty good for this neck of the woods. And so do I. I really enjoy it an awful lot, and I'll never be able to understand how they do it. They insist they don't know one note from another, yet they sit here with an air of unconcern and play the most stirring music I've ever heard. How do they do it? What's the secret? Lair's response is, "Oh, I don't know. They just do, I reckon." The sketch goes on to describe the school teacher's failed attempts to teach one little boy to read music. After she declares him hopeless, he brings an old dilapidated fiddle to school and plays tunes that amaze the teacher. Yet even in this entirely imagined performance, the script balances claims of mastery with self-effacing humility. The same tunes that bewilder and amaze the resident musical expert are also described as plain, simple. Thus, the sketch has the same kind of double edge that scholar of Appalachian culture Loyal Jones has attributed to Southern humor more broadly. Jokes could serve to level the ground between the country bumpkin and the city slicker stereotypes, but they could also serve to confirm such negative stereotypes. But perhaps more than anything, the comedy on these programs presented performers as humble and friendly. This fit the value of the genre itself, and it was also a result of shifting attitudes towards radio at the time. When radio broadcasting first began in the 1920s, the medium was the subject of many civically minded and occasionally utopian fantasies. Robert Bingham, original owner of WHAS Louisville, dreamed of his station reaching to the most rural portions of Kentucky, where a man can string an arrow from his cabin to the nearest pine tree and, sitting before a fire, have a pew in church, a seat at the opera, or a desk at the university. Stations in the 1930s continued to declare radio's power to conquer time and space, but the direction of transformative movement had been reversed, at least according to some. Instead of attempting to move listeners into the public sphere, radio programs increasingly attempted to meet them where they were, producing entertainment geared toward domestic consumption. By providing listeners with a friendly presence at home, live radio combined the spectacular with the everyday. It made bodies that were absent seem closer than ever through radio, while famous performers became visiting friends for the evening. As one promotional publication put it, the power and mystery of radio now could be found in its ability to allow musical acts to visit as friends and neighbors. Recognizing the role of radio can further help us understand why it's fairly common for barn dance programs to invoke operatic music as a foil against which to define themselves. Today, such contrasts can seem silly. The differences between country music and opera are so patently obvious that they hardly warrant comment. But media silos were not nearly as well established in the 1930s as they are today, and radio in some ways brought these two radically different genres into closer contact than ever before. While the physical spaces and social worlds of these genres were still quite distant, on the radio the only thing separating them was a few clicks of the dial, a few seconds of airtime. This fact is actually how one of the most famous institutions in country music got its name. Radio station WSM Nashville aired its first barn dance program in 1925, immediately following the Music Appreciation Hour, which played entirely classical music. The program announcer joked about the differences between these two musical offerings, saying, "For the past hour, we have been listening to music taken largely from Grand Opera, but from now on, we will present the Grand Ole Opry." Less famous jokes occurred elsewhere on barn dance radio and its various offshoots. Consider this 1938 performance by the Girls of the Golden West on the program Pinex Merrymakers and its subsequent commentary. Jokes like these are somewhat ironic, considering that it was touring European families who began the yodeling craze in the US in the late 19th century. But studying voice in Europe was clearly more about class and genre than any actual geographic origins. The point was not merely that these were skilled vocalists, but that their skill was something that even the opera singers could not attain. Listeners, too, took part in establishing this distinction. Throughout the 30s and the 40s, the letters section of WLS magazine's Standby provided a forum for debates about whether singers sounded too operatic, laughed too much, or if they had any ability whatsoever. One anonymous letter, too harsh for publication, dismissed all the national barn dance singers except Red Foley, and closed by saying, "Why not let someone sing and play that can master their instruments?" That was one I found in the archives. They did not publish that one. In an effort to appeal to the widest possible listenership that was both urban and rural, comments like Ford's concede that these were not opera singers. But, he insists, those opera singers weren't yodelers. Other listeners would join Ford in comparing the talents of musicians on barn dance radio favorably to those of more high-class genres, again, particularly opera. When one listener criticized the vocal abilities of Lulu Bell, a star on WLS Chicago, a deluge of letters sprang to her defense. One listener declared, "Lulu Bell may not be an opera star, but she gives more pleasure and happiness to people than anyone else on the radio." In other words, her skill was perhaps not comparable to the opera singers, but it was preferable and more meaningful in this context. If we had approached these recordings and scripts with the question of, is there virtuosity on these programs, thereby assuming we knew what did and should count as virtuosity in the first place, we very likely would have come away with either a list of a few particularly fast fiddle performances, or the conviction that no, virtuosity isn't present here at all, that yodeling may not have particularly impressed you. This second idea has been widespread in many circles of music studies. The traditional story has long been that it wasn't until bluegrass was introduced in the 1940s that virtuosity really appeared in country music. But what actually happened was that bluegrass brought in the far more serious and overt form of virtuosity that the early country music of previous decades explicitly rejected in favor of down-home virtuosity that I've described here. Skill was being made apparent and socially meaningful on these programs. It was just done in a way that fit the musical and cultural values of early country music, as well as the media environment of 1930s radio. So there's always a danger in a talk like this where I introduce you all to the things that I've been working on for roughly a decade, and I just simply muddle the waters. You had all heard virtuosity before for the most part. What do we need here? But I've given you what I hope is a compelling account of virtuosity's connection to media and offered a brief historical case study, but perhaps we've lost sight of that second question from my title. If virtuosity is not, as I've argued, always about the most eye-popping, exceptional displays of musical prowess, if it can in fact be any type of skill that matters to a particular group at a particular time, then why do we care? If it's not always pure excitement that it offers us, then what does it offer us? I think we can actually find an answer to this by going back to V.A. Howard. In the course of considering some examples of non-musical virtuosity, the philosopher V.A. Howard reflects on his experience watching a cheetah displaying its speed and agility as it chases a rabbit on television. I think we all know the type of program he's thinking of here, right? As he watches it, he cries out, "There! There is one of nature's great virtuoso performances." But then, is it? I asked myself in the next breath. What is missing here that disqualifies her behavior from literally being a virtuoso or virtuosa performance? Indeed, from being a performance of any kind. Reflection, I thought. She lacks a discerning audience of peers as well as a reflective self-criticism. Nor again literally could she be said to be expressing anything meaningful in or about her behavior, for that requires a symbolic medium to occur. It seems reading this that Howard initially does in fact experience this as virtuosic, but he rejects this characterization upon subsequent reflection. This is partially because, as you may recall, he conceives of virtuosity as an after-the-fact judgment of experts. It is a seal of approval, capital S, capital A, bestowed by the critical community. Beyond this absence of discerning peers, however, Howard refuses to characterize the cheetah's act as virtuosic because of the animal's presumed lack of reflection and self-awareness. Without these traits, which stand as key markers of subjectivity and agency for Howard, he finds himself unable to affirm the meaningfulness of the cheetah's display. Howard's simple example of everyday television viewing thereby inadvertently demonstrates the stakes of virtuosity. If my approach that I outlined to virtuosity as skill made apparent and socially meaningful initially provokes some seemingly straightforward questions about what counts as skill and how it comes to matter in a particular context, these questions may also form the background of much more serious inquiries. Who counts as a subject? What counts as legitimate labor? Who am I, and do I identify with or aspire to be like the performer I've just encountered? Which we am I joining myself to by affirming the skill that I've witnessed? To be clear, such questions are unlikely to explicitly occur to any of us in the moment, and I'm not trying to get inside your head and ruin any experience of impressive skill for the rest of your lives. We rarely deliberate on our amazement or even our enjoyment in the explicit way that Howard did. Instead, we see something and are dazzled in an instant. For this reason, the outward spectacle of virtuosity may provide a mirror onto some fundamental assumptions, perceptions, and interpretive habits that guide us in our everyday lives. These are what the philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer would call prejudices, or what others might simply call priors, judgments that precede an experience and make meaningful interpretation of it possible. The term prejudice has an almost constant negative connotation for us today, but that isn't what Gadamer means here. Prejudices based on hate or bigotry are certainly negative, but Gadamer's point is that we all bring something to an experience. We don't build each perception or judgment entirely up from the ground. We don't start over in each experience. We draw what we gained in prior experiences using what worked in the past. This concept of prejudice or prejudgments goes a long way to explaining the vehemence of both celebrations and condemnations of virtuosity. If virtuosity is considered readily apparent and absolutely praiseworthy, it's because it articulates ideas about agency, bodily capacity, and the value of human labor, even identity, that underlie part of our very worldview. If it's considered doubtful or even obviously objectionable, it's because it violates these same beliefs. Thank you.